see. It is a beautiful day in the neighborhood. I'm going to start in a different place. Did I tell you all the story about Wall Street?
Oh, yeah.
I did?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, this time it's actually thematic.
What the wall was meant to be doing.
With the wall, right. I'll even have pictures if I didn't have pictures before. Because even though this is an African American class, in an Afrocentric perspective, we try and give the point of view of everybody that was there.
Right.
That's relevant. Week 8, wow.
Yeah.
Okay. So, go to slide if you would. So, here's a graphic of the wall on Wall Street. That long kind of street, so you can see where the wall is with the stockades. It's running up top to bottom on screen left, and that long, largest kind of boulevard is now Broadway in Manhattan, if you're familiar with that. So the idea, of course, was, and here's the example of the wall, what it looked like if you're on the ground. So basically a series of kind of like a stockade, palisade. And, you know, when you go back to this for a second, so understand that's the lower tip of Manhattan Island, which all that's Indian country, basically under the control of the Iroquois Confederacy, among others. And lots of other people can travel, you know, so, you know, the Dutch who basically gave the idea, so Manhattan's not a European name, it's a native name. And so, you know, the idea of selling something for first of all, selling real estate for $24 worth of beads, well, no. That deal was even struck by people who actually not only didn't recognize real estate, but also it wasn't their land to give to begin with at all. Not that the Dutch were going to make that distinction. So this, even though this is it's 5 nations where each of the squares plus the white tree represents one of the 5 original nations, and then the 6th nation were added in. I'm going to be talking a little bit about 6 nations and indigenous democracy, just to give you an idea about what democracy is, since we spent a lot of airtime on African democracy. Some of the source material besides personal encounters with Mohawk history keepers is also Paul Waltz's book, The White Roots of Peace, which is available among other places on Amazon. So by way of explanation, so why we focus on 6 nations or native nations at all in an African American experience class? Well, Africans were in America before there was an America. And we made early first contact with some native nations when we came on our own as explorers, and were able to escape into other native nations when we were brought here as slaves. So 2 different pieces. A lot of the contact happened more south of the border, which isn't to say that you wouldn't have had any contact farther up with Africans, but a lot of it was basically conducted with Mexico, South America, et cetera, which is not to say that a trading relationship didn't happen with other native nations farther into what we call North America. So our forms of democracy were similar in that every adult human being was a citizen, and political leaders could be of many genders and gender expressions. So it wasn't even about necessarily, as we see here in our forms of democracy, where you have to be a male, married, heterosexual. I mean, we've never had have we ever had a single American president? I don't think we have, right? So much is being made, for example, of Governor Brown being the first openly bisexual governor in Oregon history, but I mean, okay, interesting, but do we really need to know that? Or is that, I mean, she's a champion of women's rights and equality and all kinds of things, regardless of that politic. So, while some native nations had slavery and even had African slaves after they began to be imported, treatment of those slaves was better in some ways, though there are naturally arguments to be made both ways than whites. So white indentured servants, particularly women, might escape into Indian country where they could live a freer life, which is one of the purposes of the wall on Wall Street, is to keep people out. I mean, not keep people from escaping, not so much keeping the Indians from that part of the island, because obviously you're surrounded. How are you going to keep people off? So the Iroquois Confederacy, if you want to, for lack of a better word, had control of Manhattan Island. And there are many other powerful confederacies, Native American governments, and military powers who controlled the entire eastern seaboard. Essentially, that's all Indian country. So from an Afrocentric point of view, and I'm not justifying this, but there's a reason that the native nations had to be destroyed in terms of manifest destiny. So create America. So they had to be destroyed to create America. And the part of the reason they had to be destroyed is that their acceptance and utilization of diversity, as well as representing a civilized alternative to slave-based chattel slavery, indentured servitude, and essentially the growing capitalist economy, which carries with it the idea that people have worth and they're not equal, and that people who have more money or more wealth are worth more than others and have more value as human beings than those who are in poverty, even though the conditions that make wealth are artificial. And basically Native nations understood that, Sometimes people could be good hunters or have a good harvest season or not, but that didn't necessarily make them worse people, and it was incumbent upon the society to take care of those folks. So not believing in poor people and not allowing people to be homeless, not allowing people to be starving, but basically taking care of all members of society as a point of honor within that civilization, which is not part of the value that America as America was founded on, all right? And as well as their democratic process. So the democratic process that we're talking about, democratic is an Egyptian word, demo meaning people. So it's not necessarily something that we're basically using the English language to kind of define what we're seeing, and that could be problematic. But I'll gamely go on. So I like to use sources for people's history from those actual folks. This particular website is from the Iroquois Museum, and some of the information comes from that. The Iroquois Confederacy, speaking in present tense, is composed of 6 nations. And each nation has clans. And spelled with a C, basically the implication being kinship groups. So a person's clan is the same as their mother's clan. So you're born into a clan, or you can marry into a clan. The members of each clan, we covered this a little bit last Wednesday, but the members of each clan are all related to each other or through their mothers, and this is called the matrilineal system. Each clan is represented by a different animal. Traditionally, a person could not marry someone within the same clan. So there are presently 9 clans. There used to be more in other historical times. They're divided into animal clans from 3 different earth elements: land, air, and water. The water creatures are turtle, beaver, and eel clan. The land creatures are deer, wolf, and bear. And the creatures of the sky are hawk, heron, and snipe. The last two being essentially water creatures. So the natural world is then symbolized by these beings, the beings of land, air, and water, and 9 animal clans. So prior to the peacemaker, now by their, within their cultural and worldview framework, you do not refer to a person that's crossed on by name, because it is considered that the spirit of that person still exists, and so you don't want to call them to you unless you have specific work or specific request, because it's as if they're still alive, even though this person historically has been crossed since 1100 in the Common Era. So their convention is to refer to him as the peacemaker, but his chief disciple, if you will, they do refer to it by name, and that's the classic Hiawatha. And there's a whole story around that, which I probably won't get into, but it basically figures into the creation story of how the Confederacy got formed. So prior to the peacemaker, there were numerous other clans, such as Sweet Potato, Rock and Ball clan. So after the formation of the Iroquois Confederacy, the number of clans was reduced to 9, represented not necessarily below, but basically where I essentially rewrote this, the 3 elements and the 3 animals related to the elements, so the 9 clans. So the Mohawk were a people of the Flint, which is what Kanienk Kehaka means, people of the Flint. They have bear, wolf, and turtle clans. The Oneida, people of the Standing Stone, also bear, wolf, and turtle. The Onondaga, people of the hills, bear, wolf, turtle, deer, eel, hawk, beaver, heron, snipe. Cayuga, people of the Great Swamp, bear, wolf, turtle, heron, and snipe. Seneca, people of the Great Hill, bear, wolf, turtle, beaver, heron, snipe, hawk, deer. So within the 6 nations, you can see that there's a scattering of all these different clans within all of them, which basically talks about not only common history, but intermarriage patterns, if you want to get into that, plus other aspects of the worldview. And then the Tuscarora, which is the 6th and the last of the original 5. Well, last of the first, it was the 5 nations, and then the Tuscarora were added later. So the shirt-wearing people: bear, wolf, turtle, beaver, snipe, deer, and eel. Yes?
And all the various animals, they were all considered to be of equal value?
Yes.
Didn't matter?
Yes. So, just because, I often look for patterns, especially patterns which kind of give relevance to today. And as a drug counselor, I'm always interested in people's, the way I call it is axiochemistry. And Handsome Lake was a Seneca religious leader of the Iroquois people. He was also half-brother to Corn Planter, another historical figure. So Handsome Lake, we talk about, for example, in the addictions field, about people, about recovery frameworks, and while 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous and Narcotics Anonymous and all the other anonymous self-help groups have name familiarity, the indigenous recovery framework to here is the one that is now called by its name the Wellbriety Movement, which traces its roots to Handsome Lake. So played a major role in the reawakening of the people of the Longhouse Haudenosaunee, people of the Longhouse, or Six Nations Iroquois Confederacy. He preached a message that combined traditional religious beliefs with a revised code meant to bring consciousness to the Haudenosaunee after a long period of cultural disintegration following colonization. This message was eventually published as the Code of Handsome Lake and is still practiced today. So, to put this in context, the peacemaker, known by a name that starts with a D and ends in an H, and his disciple, if you will, Hiawatha, founded basically after a period of war, strife, rape, murder, warring among the five nations, basically attempted to implement a vision of peace to unite all the warring five nations and create a code of conduct, and basically creating essentially the Longhouse, which is made of the white pine, the sacred white pine, which is basically where the white roots of peace come from. The white roots of peace are the sacred pine, from which you, among other things, make the Longhouse. And so the Haudenosaunee people of the Longhouse, that's Six Nations. So they're creating this indigenous form of democracy around 1100 in the Common Era out of a condition of strife, and to create unity, and that unity begins to hold and remains powerful until the influences of colonization. Now, particularly what happens with colonization is the imposition of certain technologies, artifacts, religious beliefs that begin to disrupt it. And Handsome Lake, then, in his own right, becoming alcoholic, begins to essentially recognize, wow, this is breaking up our Indian way of life. And so that's part of the Code of Handsome Lake that is now reflected within the Wellbriety movement, which is, it's not simply just abstinence from alcohol and other drugs. We also have to recreate our Indian way of life that got disrupted as part of that process. And so Handsome Lake is seen as one of the progenitors of that movement, where it's not simply substance abuse recovery, but it's also cultural recovery too. Yes?
And wasn't he seen by like the colonizers as like a major revolutionary force and therefore dangerous?
Yes.
Because he was trying to get them to return to the old way.
Yes. And this became kind of I mean, again, so when I'm saying, I'm not making a wild claim and saying that it's paranoia to say that the Indian nations weren't targeted for destruction. They were.
Consciously. Quite
Deliberately, in a lot of different ways. And there are a lot of different, shall we say, weapons used. So certainly, certainly Native people themselves could recognize, for example, the three, what I refer to as Trojan horses: the Bible, the bottle, and the casino. So they're basically, each one of those technologies is a certain worldview that will disrupt the native way of life and seeks to supplant the native traditional way of life by saying, well, our way is better. So Six Nations. Handsome Lake was born around 1735 in the Seneca village of Conewagas, located on the Genesee River near Avon, New York. Very little is known of his parents. He was born into the Wolf Clan and was named Hadawako, shaking snow, but was eventually adopted and raised by the Turtle Clan people. He was a half-brother to Corn Planter and an uncle of Red Jacket. During the time when the Seneca Nation was at its peak of prosperity, Handsome Lake witnessed the gradual deterioration of his society. In 1794, he signed the U.S. treaty with the Six Nations, known as the Pickering Treaty, and visited D.C. in 1802. Now, when I talk about, and in the process of developing within the Recovery Center, also a series of classes looking at the use of drug substances. So, and refer to this particular point of view within the Afro-axiochemistry. So axiochemistry itself is basically the view that a culture has a specific approach to alcohol and drugs and recovery and prevention that's based within its cultural values. So combining axiology with chemistry. And so observing the uses of drug substances, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 uses of drug substances, from medicine, sacrament, artistic inspiration, leisure. So most substances start out as medicine. So the axiochemistry that we encountered with Native Americans, there were like 800 different substances that were used as medicines. Something like 80 of them are still in use today, though not in their necessarily original form, because white people don't like chewing white willow bark for their headaches. They like aspirin. They don't like chewing coca leaves because coca leaves are nasty. They believe in cocaine or the original Coca-Cola, right? There also, so sacrament, there are powerful drug substances that are psychoactive. So whether that's the little smoke marijuana, ayahuasca, peyote, et cetera, and sometimes with the native nations that had alcohol technology. So understand that when you have, so this also includes tobacco, by the way, in its original form. So tobacco in its original form was essentially grown and used not to inhale the smoke, but to basically symbolically represent the breath. And so it was shared, basically sharing the breath of life that we all share. So you symbolically, the pipe, the bowl of the pipe represents the feminine, the stem represents the masculine, so you basically insert one in the other, you're creating a unity. Fire, the herb is the earth, fire, the smoke is the air, and the breath of life is the water element. So you're basically combining all the classical elements and opposites to create peace. Yes?
Which also enables you to visualize your breath.
Right.
Cool.
Right. So you're not necessarily smoking, you know, in an addictive way, because you're not inhaling, and it's a sacrament to induce sacred mind. And so the same idea in terms of those native nations that also had alcohol technology, which meant that they had, for example, agriculture. So alcohol comes from an agricultural surplus. That is, if you have non-distilled forms of alcohol. So in order to have distilled, basically beer and wine strength alcohol, all you need is an agricultural surplus and a climate that allows, for example, fruit and grain to ferment at room temperature. Right, so obviously Inuit people, you know, living in the far Arctic, don't have alcohol technology because there's no agriculture. Right? But you would have Eastern tribes that basically would deal with elderberry wine. You would have the Aztecs who would basically be dealing with corn forms of beer and basically beer and wine strength alcohol. And the value was that these substances are only to be used within a religious ceremony and not to intoxication. And also, they understood within their particular axiochemistry that alcohol hurt the developing fetus, so children weren't allowed to drink, and pregnant women weren't allowed to drink, and in any case, you don't drink to intoxication. So, what Handsome Lake is basically looking at what the effect of what is happening within their particular society, these cultural patterns that I'm talking about that were non-addictive, because they are basically involving beer and wine strength alcohol, basically were being disrupted by the introduction of essentially what we would call stereotypically firewater, that is distilled alcohol, which the Westerners got from the Egyptians, who had their as part of their axiochemistry, we're not going to release the secret of how to do alcohol to the general public. Even though it was a state secret, but with conquest by the Greeks and the Romans, distilled alcohol technology got leaked to the general public. So by the time that you have, for example, the 1600s, basically distilled alcohol technology is a part of European culture, in addition to brewing wine and beer. So distilled spirits then become, as we've talked about, the Puritans giving rum to 4-year-olds, and rum being part of the slave trade. So part of the ubiquity of rum means that, yeah, if you're giving rum to 4-year-olds, then, I mean, that's not something we do in the 21st century. We think of that as child abuse. Their value with rum, the Puritans, and I mean the English-speaking Europeans who were giving rum to their children, is that the rum was no more harmful for you than water. They didn't have a concept of addiction at the time. So knowing from the 21st century, from our point of view, that what you start giving rum to a 4-year-old, by the time that they're legally an adult within their particular culture at 13, 14, 15, they're going to have a raging alcoholic habit and tolerance. And so if the value is, well, we can beat our women and children and be drunk and under the influence, and the rule of thumb, that meaning in English common law, you have the right to beat your wife and children as long as the stick that you use is no thicker than your thumb. Well, yeah, if that's going to be a dangerous recipe for domestic violence. So yes, this taking alcohol out of the medicine sacrament category, the realm of the healers, and then into the idea that it's going to be a source of wealth and leisure, a tool of leisure. The concept of leisure basically comes from certain civilizations within certain forms where, we're not just hunting and gathering and doing things for survival. We actually have enough time to kick back. So then a source of wealth, when a drug becomes a source of wealth, also opiate of the masses, to borrow that term from Marx, basically it becomes ubiquitous enough so that it becomes a political tool, because then you can influence elections and basically exert power. Once you use that political tool, so for example, in the Virginia Commonwealth, George Washington's first election, he lost because basically the practice of his rivals was to give away alcohol as an inducement to vote. And he didn't stoop to that level, so he lost his first election. Then after that, his next election, he did so stoop, and the rest is history, as it were. So literally a political tool, but if you understand that politics is the exercise of power, if you can use a drug to influence an election, why not a war? Or why not disrupt a culture? So then that's only the next step then is substance as a weapon. And so this is part of what was going on with Six Nations, is that because of colonization, they're not only getting exposed to a culture that has not only different religious beliefs, but also different economic beliefs, and was willing to use those economic beliefs to disrupt the powerful hold that Six Nations had, or the perceived threat that Six Nations existed to the emerging American order. So with Handsome Lake then, multiple factors would lead to the erosion of morale and the spiritual welfare of the Six Nations people. In the period immediately after the American Revolution, Six Nations lost most of their land and were forced to live on reservations. which meant that they had not only lost militarily, but were basically starting to lose political and economic control. So the reservations, as all reservations did, provided poor living conditions and little or no opportunity for formal education or cultural autonomy. And so as a result, so much change over a relatively short period of time. Many Six Nations people began to turn towards alcohol, which is also often a reaction to physical genocide as well as cultural genocide. When you don't have your normal, when you aren't allowed to practice your religion or cultural coping mechanisms, you're forced to adopt the ones that are imposed on you, if there are any imposed on you. And so, for example, it was before 1952, according to federal law, it was illegal to give Native people alcohol. Illegal. Before 1952. Before 1978, it was illegal for natives to practice their spiritual beliefs by federal law. Okay? So when you put someone on a reservation and then you forbid them from speaking their language, you take their children, you flood their reservations, which are basically maintained by military force. You flood the reservations with alcohol. There's going to be some cultural disruption there, plus induced addiction. Yes?
So you force them to a point of complete and total desperation.
Yes.
And then give them enough booze so they just stay quiet.
Right. An addicted population is a controlled population.
Form of incarceration, spiritually and physically.
Yes. I mean, that's what a reservation is. So, I mean, it's the same concept when we were talking about ghetto. Ghetto Island was originally a place off of the coast of Europe, off of the coast of Italy, where people were literally sent to die. Not just simply the, in the Polish, where ghetto means foundry, where Jews were forced to live in the industrial part of let's see, the capital city of Poland.
Warsaw?
Warsaw, thank you. The Warsaw Ghetto, right? So, it's not just that they were forced to live there, it's also they could be killed for leaving that place. So the concept of reservation, ghetto as reservation, is basically the same thing, right? So it doesn't matter whether you create it by military means or economic means, or have it in their head. So essentially one of the things that's happening with Handsome Lake is, trying to, rebel against is, through throwing off his own alcoholism, is kind of like, it's literally a cultural fall. So this situation results in the cultural clash between the fledgling United States and the once equally powerful Six Nations people. The traditional religious rituals alone were no longer applicable to the environment the Haudenosaunee people found themselves in. And that is also, when we talk about the influence of tradition and innovation within African American culture, this is one of the things that we understand that we have to guard against, is that traditions have to evolve with the times, and if they don't, adherence to them can kill you, lead to the end of the people. So every tradition was once an innovation to a newly evolved set of circumstances that worked. And because it continued to work, it became a tradition. But it was once, each tradition was once an innovation. So you have to keep both of those things going. Both tradition and innovation. When the traditions stop working, create ones that do work. So in 1799, after a period of illness due to many years of excessive alcohol indulgence, Handsome Lake had the first of a series of visions. In his first vision, he was warned by 3 spiritual messengers about the dangers associated with alcohol. He is also told that witches were creating chaos within his tribe and that the persons guilty of witchcraft must repent and confess. Now, notice where this is in relation to, for example, the Salem witch trials. So, certainly, and there is also an element of this within the founding of Six Nations, where Hiawatha literally means he who straightens out the hair, because there was a figure, I believe his name was Tadaho, who was considered a very powerful sorcerer. And he had snakes living in his hair. And he was the last holdout to creating the unity of the five nations. And he was very powerful. And so the peacemaker in Hiawatha met with him and eventually were able to persuade him to join the five nations. And thereafter, I guess as the legend goes, whether it's symbolic or not, whether they're talking about dreadlocks or not, he straightened out his hair and basically joined the nation, right? But he was considered a very powerful sorcerer, and then became also one of the names of the Tadaho is one of the traditional names for one of the chiefs in Six Nations. So when Handsome Lake then is told that he has to give up alcohol, and it's probably distilled spirits, fire water that he's getting from the Europeans, as opposed to whatever the tradition, if there were traditions, it was basically using the beer and wine strength alcohol as opposed to fire water. So if he's warned by three spiritual messengers about the dangers associated with alcohol, well, that's kind of a non-ordinary reality. So how is that, for example, distinct from being a witch? Talking to a spiritual being that may or may not be alive, or you're speaking with the dead. How is that not witchcraft? But won't get into that. Handsome Lake was directed to reveal these warnings to the people. His nephew, Owen Blacksnake, also known as Scandios Swati, and half-brother Cornplanter were with him during this time and believed in the power of his visions and their revelations. Shortly after Handsome Lake's first vision, he ceased drinking alcohol. When he regained his health, he began bringing a message of the good word to his people. He preached against drunkenness and other evil practices, and his message was outlined as a moral code that was eventually referred to as the Code of Handsome Lake, which part of that code is part of the Wellbriety movement today, which basically talks about abstinence from alcohol, as well as some of the indigenous practices, culture that help protect the people traditionally and also in changing times. So the code outlaws drunkenness, witchcraft, sexual promiscuity, wife beating, quarreling, and gambling. Handsome Lake presented his message along with a threat that fire would destroy the world if this code was not obeyed. Now, you can see here there are some influences, obviously, from the religious beliefs and practices of certain forms of Christianity here, too. Because let's not discount the fact that missionaries were part of the early influences within Turtle Island in terms of the belief system about making treaties, salvation of your soul. You'll be destroyed, by the fire next time because we've already gone through the flood, right? So, Six Nations of the Iroquois: Onondaga, Oneida, Seneca, Tuscarora, Mohawk, Cayuga. And the white roots of peace is essentially like a constitution. And this particular website basically talks about some of the elements of the white roots of peace, including, for example, 5 nations, 10 animal clans, because even though it's been reduced to 9 in modern times, there were more. So 5 nations, 10 clans each, that's 50. So where do we get 50 states from? And so the clan mothers, and I think there are succeeding slides that talk about this. So here's what indigenous democracy looks like. Clan mothers elect chiefs. So in terms of recovering the white roots of peace, so the white roots of peace refers to the code developed in the 10th century here in northeastern Turtle Island among the Iroquois Confederacy, as it's known in English. The white roots refer to the roots of the sacred white pine, which shelters all the people and from which longhouses are made. And these are the people of some of the original longhouses. So, the Confederacy was and is composed of 6 nations. Each nation has clans. Person's clan is the same as their mother's clan. We've talked about much of this already. So the peacemaker came roughly in 1142, 10th century, and that's basically according to an event as well as an eclipse, which is how we got cross-dated it so precisely. Clan mothers would select chiefs and unselect chiefs, remind chiefs of their duties, give clan names to children, distribute goods of those who have died, and meet obligations to sacred societies. Clan mothers also evaluate the chief's dedication to those who are yet to come, up to the 7th generation. Now, that concept of 7th generation, so for example, there was a treaty that stated that the United States was supposed to honor something as long as the grass growed and the river flowed. Now, because that's an ambiguous time, right? This 7th generation business was kind of translated into English to mean, say, like 140 years, right? But it's not just 7 generations into the future, it's also 7 generations into the past simultaneously. So in other words, nearly 300 years of time and a time span. So not only dedication to those yet to come, but also those who had been. So the clan system flourishes still among those who follow the traditional system, but lots of Iroquois of all faiths. So in other words, there are multiple faiths because of the whole process of colonization, missionaries, etc., etc. So you'll see, even in Handsome Lake's time, even with Handsome Lake, you know, when I talk about memes coming from different places and taking root and mutating, so you have this blending of a traditional pre-Christian worldview with Christian beliefs, especially if you're not necessarily being allowed to practice your religion, but have to adopt the ways of the Westerners. So in traditional government, chiefs are responsible to help those in their clan, and as a mark of their identity today, many Iroquois will wear their clan or display their homes, part of their signature, their clan animal symbol. So when whites came, with white women, African slaves, and others would often escape oppressive colonial society and live with indigenous people, naturally they're going to go into Indian country. Rightfully, they'd be seeing greater freedom than that afforded under the colonial governments, which began to pass laws guaranteeing rights and privileges by race and, of course, gender. So the founding fathers, we the people, did not mean all human beings present, like the indigenous credo translated into English as all my relations. All my relations, of course, did not simply mean only human beings, but others in which sentience, that is consciousness, may be found. So if one has the wits and culture to perceive it as such. So the reason you take after animal clans is not because you're an animal, but because you like the qualities of those particular creatures, whatever they're able to do in whatever element that they exist in. So a statement attributed to the great peacemaker. Be strong of mind, O chiefs. Carry no anger and hold no grudges. Think not forever of yourselves, O chiefs, nor of your own generation. Think of continuing generations of our family. Think of our grandchildren and of those yet unborn, whose faces are coming from beneath the ground. So if you combine this, for example, then with, and contrast this with a maroon worldview, right? It's the same, even though they're separated by oceans, right? Unborn children and the ancestors live in the invisible world. You might bury your ancestors in the ground, but they're going to come back as children. So you have to take them into consideration. So it's a small wonder then, really, given that Africans had contact with Turtle Island before, many of these ideas could have taken root or could have developed independently, but it's no real surprise why so many basically would migrate into Indian country and be accepted. Yeah, Eddie?
Just like when the Africans originally, came to Turtle Island, I mean, they wouldn't just go and take off again. They'd stay secret. Obviously, there was conversation and, discussing each other's cultural habits, so there had to be exchange.
Yeah, there had to be exchanges, right?
Philosophical exchange.
Yeah. So the peacemaker, so extensive military power. So for example, when I got into a fight with a Tea Partier. So I had to explain to him when he said that there was no government here before white people brought it. No. When colonists had the original Boston Tea Party, they dressed up in native drag, if you will, because they know the British wouldn't retaliate against Six Nations in any case, because Six Nations was the military power. But the British knew that natives had no interest in destroying tea, right? And in any case, as a society and as a government, they'd levied no taxes either, no poor people, no debtor's prison, no prison, and had no poor people and had female leadership. So it was often left to men to interface with the whites, though, within that society. Just like other native nations would use black people to interface between the native nations and white society, particularly the Cherokee and also other so-called five civilized tribes. So the model existed for a federal system of government, a representative democracy, which since the founding fathers essentially only knew monarchies, they studied the model for living among the Iroquois, by living among the Iroquois, and a number of them did that. Now, what they didn't do, of course, was then replicate the model of female leadership and also who's a citizen, right? They didn't have a context for model for democracy that incorporated human diversity. They didn't. Or rather than one that was based on white supremacy, essentially, because remember at this time also, following what was in the Inquisition, Christianity was largely whites only. So jumping, because we have essentially 2 weeks, so I've got to cover, we're now in the early 1800s. A previous book referred to this time period as the generation of crisis and the Jubilee War, which is commonly referred to as the Civil War, or the War of Northern Aggression, depending on which one you want to believe. And we'll also talk about black patriots, black Indians, black cattlemen. So one of the books that helped build this class was Lerone Bennett's classic, Before the Mayflower. So he referred to the run-up of the Civil War as the generation of crisis. So generation's about 20 years. But this crisis had been going on since essentially the founding of the country. The crisis is basically black people have fought in every war that America ever fought in, and most are still not citizens. So you would think, okay, well, yeah, one mark of citizenship is not only voting, but also being able to defend the society that you're in, right? And so black people basically have fought in every war, and not only have we been on Turtle Island since before there was an America, but in the fights to create America, mostly when it didn't involve us fighting against native folks, because we didn't, well, I'm not going to say that we didn't do that, but I am going to say that a lot of the wars that we fought against were basically against other European powers, not so much the native nations. Okay, the S word, slavery, is the big issue. Money, of course, is also the issue. So I think I might have explained the word shibboleth, but here I'm going to do it formally. A word or pronunciation that distinguishes people of one group or class from those of another. A word or phrase identified with a particular group or a cause. A catchword, a commonplace saying or idea. A custom or practice that betrays one as an outsider. So ultimately, this word is from the Hebrew shibboleth, which means a torrent of water. From the use of the word, that word in, this is a biblical reference in Judges, to distinguish one tribe from another, who pronounced it shibboleth. So TH instead of shibboleth, silent H. In Judges, there's the biblical reference. The different pronunciation basically marks you as an enemy and is used to kill. Because obviously, if this is the way that you call and distinguish them, they look the same. You can't distinguish them by color, right? Which is, yeah, these are Africans. So Bennett uses this example to point out several things with shibboleth. Shibboleths aren't simply about pronunciation of words. They can also be catchphrases, symbols, or particular ideas which identify people or groups of people or identify a political point of view. For example, live free or die, adopted by the Tea Party movement and also used as part of the American Revolution. Give me liberty or give me death. Give me Librium or give me meth. No. Remember the Alamo. The term patriot, the Patriot Act, cowboy, GI Joe, government issue, Joe, common name, Joe, GI Joe. Civil War, the war between the states, war of northern aggression. So is the Civil War about slavery or is it not about slavery? Well, that completely depends on your point of view. And the phrases you use to talk about it, those are shibboleths. Okay, the answer marks you as much as your accent would. So for example, as shibboleth, racism, reverse racism. So in the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, the definition of racism from 1970, prejudice plus power equals racism. So we can, from that, using that particular definition, we can all have personal prejudices, and we can individually all express those personal prejudices, but we do not all have the ability to reinforce our prejudices with policy or law, or create or benefit from privilege systems. Okay, we can use our personal power against individuals, but that's not the same as social policy. So for example, the term rock and roll, which was a form of music which was used when Elvis basically essentially stole it from black people, That's because with white privilege, he could go into black juke joints and hear the music, but black people could not go listen to Elvis play. In fact, Elvis couldn't be played on the radio because it was referred to as race music. In other words, black music. Right? So that's not necessarily reverse racism, okay? Because yes, people of color can show prejudice against white people, but you know, when Elvis goes into basically an all-black neighborhood or an all-black juke joint, he can do that without fear of being attacked. Because if he does get attacked, the Ku Klux Klan can come in and destroy that juke joint. But let one of those black people attempt to go eat at a lunch counter in the South. So reverse racism, only if you're going to use a strict definition, doesn't really happen, but you might be able to stretch it by saying, yeah, if you go into a majority person of color environment, they may be able to express personal prejudice against you in that environment, but that's not going to hold outside that environment. Okay? So conflating, that is mixing together or equating prejudice and racism, that's inaccurate. It's common practice, but it's inaccurate. A person or a group of people can verbally or physically attack you, and at that point, the distinction between prejudice and racism doesn't mean much to you personally, but it does not constitute social policy. And that's what racism is a social policy reinforced by laws. Reverse discrimination, which is the only place that actually has meaning, is in hiring. Where basically a less qualified minority is hired over a more qualified white person to fill some affirmative action quota. Now, affirmative action is itself a shibboleth, because it implies that, oh, you're not actually qualified, but we have to basically fill this quota in order basically to receive federal funding. So in the case law, where such claims have been brought to trial, they've been proven true 3% of the time. That is, yes, 3% of the time, in fact, a lower qualified minority got hired in place of a more qualified white person. 3% of the time. So 97% of the time, nope, not founded. The minority was actually more qualified than the white person. I can actually illustrate this in an LCC context. Shall I?
Sure.
Bless you. Okay, take for example LCC, an employer. We haven't gotten to this part of history yet, but in the 1800s, one of the things that's going on is racially preferential hiring, where we're still under slavery. Okay? So basically, affirmative action is against historical discrimination. In hiring and college admissions. Now, this historical piece, I mean, if it's historical, it's also happening now. And there's a structure producing it. affirmative action may or may not acknowledge that the structure is producing it, but that's in fact what's happening. There's a structure producing it. All right? So let's take, let's see, LCC. Let's take, since I'm a faculty member, faculty. All right? So we've had roughly about 250 full-time faculty. And basically, affirmative action requires that you do a comparison of certain classes of worker, like faculty, to your local hiring area. Okay? Now, for a full-time faculty, in a college and university environment, you do not compare to Lane County. You compare to the nation. Because faculty are trained all over the nation, right? Okay, so the local hiring for area for full-time faculty for any full-time faculty job is the country, not Oregon. Yes?
Would that apply to like high schools and everything?
High schools can use a different standard because, you know, they're more local.
That's what I was thinking.
Yeah, but, which is why there was an op-ed in the Register Guard by this, I think he's a Persian professor from Portland State, but basically talked about minority teacher hiring initiatives that were passed into law in 1991, et cetera, that were basically looking at local. So local is another interesting piece in itself. So yes, they're applied. If you receive either $1 of federal funds or have 50 or more employees, affirmative action applies to you. Okay, so we definitely do, right? With 11,000 students and 1,000, or more employees, right? So 250 full-time faculty. So you do. Let's say I'm African American, right? I'm 1/32 white, but okay, I'm African American. And that's how I identify for affirmative action, when I check the box in hiring to get hired here. So nationally, African Americans, that's AA, African Americans, are 10%, at the time of my hire, 1992, African Americans were 10% of faculty in college. Nationally, 10%. And higher, depending on what the discipline it was. So for example, for foreign languages, so across the board for foreign languages, 1/3 of foreign language faculty are native speakers. So whether that's German, Spanish, Chinese, native speakers. Make sense, right? So, for example then, nationally, so that would mean that if LCC, were transparent and matched this number, there would be 25 black faculty. At Lane. Okay? So, historically, there have never been more than 7 at any one time. And that was at the peak in 1999. But of course, yeah. All right, in its history, LCC has hired 42 African Americans in all capacities. So less than 1 a year. All right? So the affirmative action quota is this, okay? Which is not a quota, it's a goal. And the goal is based on who's working in your particular job classification in your local hiring area, whatever that is. that's the goal that you're supposed to reach, so that you're matching, so that discrimination doesn't exist. And if your numbers are lower, you're supposed to make a good faith effort to increase them up to whatever this place is, whatever that is. Okay? So that's the so-called quota, which is actually not a quota, because the reality of how affirmative action has worked, whether it's been in hiring or college admissions, is it has never, ever achieved those goals. In fact, when there have been court cases to try and prove reverse discrimination or against affirmative action, we're talking about a particular law school, so one section of a college where the admission for one term approached 10% to a law school, not the college as a whole, to a law school for one term. 10% minority admission. And then that's when they filed the lawsuit. And it was, for example, in the Bakke case. Bakke, there were actually white applicants that got accepted before him that were more numerous than 3 or 4 minority applicants that he sued against. But he wouldn't have gotten in anyway. But he's saying, oh, it's not fair that you let in 3 minorities, but the 10 white people, well, that's okay. Right? So, affirmative action is like a shibboleth. All right? And when you start digging around more into the facts behind it, you begin to wonder, okay, so what are they exactly objecting to? If affirmative action is essentially a weak remedy. It has never achieved its goals, right? Which simply means that the structures that basically produce that. So when I often talked about my particular hire, so there were 44 faculty positions open in 1992, 1,400 applications for those 44 positions, 160 of those minority. Okay, so about 11%. All right, so they're hearing about the jobs, they're applying for the jobs, and that result then, if the hiring processes were transparent, then you'd expect maybe, 10% hired, right? Which would be 4 people, right? They hired me. So it's possible that one minority person out of 160 is the only one qualified. Maybe. I mean, I'm good, but not that good. Okay, so the feds require that you, under affirmative action law, essentially ask you to analyze why and where, right? So this is not random chance. This result, one minority out of 160, is 3 standard deviations from chance, and the federal recognition that discrimination is going on is 2 standard deviations. So, discrimination is definitely happening in LCC hiring, definitely, no question, against minorities, clearly.
Are there no sanctions against the institution if they fail to?
You actually have to be trying to make a good faith effort, but one of the pieces that happens with that is basically by the African American elders who were here before me, in terms of being faculty, they basically said, yes, when managers were more in control of the hiring process, we had more minorities. The more that faculty got involved, and majority white faculty, minority numbers went down. And the few minorities that did get in, essentially were made to feel unwelcome. So there are some of us who don't run off easily, shall we say. Myself being one of them.
So why did it change from management to faculty?
Oh, faculty pressure.
Okay.
Oh, we want to be more involved. Okay, let's follow the law. Let's not just hire your friends from the U of O. Let's hire people nationally. I mean, there are some departments which feel that diversity is hiring white guys from Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming. That's diversity.
As opposed from Oregon.
Yeah, right. Or hiring somebody else from somewhere else that, you know, English is their fifth language and they can teach in 4 languages and, you know, can also develop math skill, et cetera, in students, and, you know, I could go on. But it's not about hiring diversity, necessarily. It's hiring who they feel comfortable with. So, anyway, the numbers basically show active discrimination is going on, and the historical numbers with 42 African Americans in history, yeah, clearly something structural is going on. And you can name where that is and who. And, you know, I've seen where hiring discrimination is continuing to this day. So, having said that, then what do you do about it? Okay? So, in the case law where the claims about reverse discrimination, that hasn't been proven. Okay? But we can definitely prove that hiring discrimination is happening here and other places too. You had a question?
So a shibboleth basically is like a phrase, a catchword, which in effect is almost a code for a much larger issue.
Yes,
Got it.
exactly, right.
It's like a label identifying.
And a label, and it identifies your views on it. So, you know, basically, you know, if they hire one minority out of 160, that's not affirmative action. That usually meant, you know, and basically the pattern has existed here, you have to be so good that it looks stupid not to hire you, and the fact that you're black is, oh, well, we can get affirmative action points for that. Well, not really. Not just for hiring one, right? So, in the case of the word, for example, the N-word, nigger, is internal to the culture emically, but it has been used as a weapon, as a means of identifying shared suffering. Thus, contextually within the culture, the word is allowed, right? But outside of the culture, it's a weapon. Okay? If you don't share the suffering, you can't use the word, no matter how many black friends you have. So that's the nuance. When is it appropriate to call a woman a bitch, a lesbian, a dyke, a gay man, a faggot, without knowing the history of the word and sharing the suffering? We're acknowledging that. Okay, very similar. So those things are also shibboleths. So if we name some patriots.
Thomas Paine.
Thomas Paine. I like Thomas Paine.
Edward Snowden.
Thomas Paine. Tom Paine. Ed Snowden. I'll have to see that movie too.
It's good.
Ed Snowden. Who else? The founding fathers did not like Thomas Paine. I can tell you're a lefty radical if you even know about Tom Paine. And Edward Snowden, that's definitely a shibboleth. Who else?
Oh man, Patriots.
All right, I'm going to reflect and add to the lecture, but previous brainstorms, go to slide, so past brainstorm results. Mel Gibson, Kevin Costner. You know, and it's really interesting how the 10 most trusted people in America are all actors who essentially lie for a living.
John Wayne.
John Wayne, right. George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Patrick Henry, Martin Luther King, Betsy Ross, Barbara Frecci, Angela Davis, Assata Shakur, that was clearly from this class, right? Michael Moore, George W. Bush, Maya Lim. So a patriot. Who or what is a patriot, and what is the image of a patriot? Who was the first person to die at the Boston Massacre?
A black man.
A black man, right. My Tea Party guy didn't even know that. Anyway, Crispus Attucks. Was he slave or free?
I think he was free.
He was free. He was a black Indian. Okay? And so part of the rules extend to the status of the mother. Were you slave or free? Was mom slave or free?
Northrop.
Yeah, Solomon Northup, right. The movie Belle, okay? She was a black woman in George's England, the same George III that we fought in Charlotte's time. So she was a black woman in Charlotte's time whose father was a British sea captain, and her mother was a slave, but she was freed and lived on British soil. Therefore, her father adopted her and then gave her an inheritance, so when she died, she actually had money and lived with his uncle, who was the Supreme Court judge. Anyway, so, Amazing Grace. John Newton. So, Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found, was blind, but now I see. 'Twas grace that taught my heart to fear, and grace my fears relieved. How precious did that grace appear, the hour I first believed. Now, this time period that we're talking about, late 1700s, slavery is still going on. This guy who wrote Amazing Grace, or who's attributed to who have written Amazing Grace, or from the point of view of this class, stole an African hymn from slaves that were in his capture and he said the inspiration for this song came when he was in a storm as a slaver, that is, captaining a slave ship. And he started praying because it looked like they were going to be sinking. And the slaves were kind of singing this melody, which is what he took to write and put words to. Yeah.
Would the slave song have been some sort of a prayer? Because they'd be just as afraid as everybody else.
Yes, it would have been.
Okay.
So when they say the origin of the melody is unknown, most hymnals attributed to an early American folk melody. There was a Bill Moyer special on Amazing Grace, speculated that it may have originated as the tune of a song the slaves sang. And, you know, in my opinion, as a musician, nobody sings Amazing Grace like black people, probably because it's our song. Because, you know, again, they say that it's an early American folk melody, then where is that from? I mean, they would name that. Because, by the way, many of our American patriotic songs, to get back on patriotism for a second, are British songs. Like, the Star-Spangled Banner is a British drinking song, which I guess, given what goes on at football games, not surprising. Patriotism and beer. And America, let's see, not America the Beautiful, but God Save the King. My Country 'Tis of Thee, God Save the King or Queen. British songs. So probably it's our song. So Newton was born in London, son of a commander of a merchant ship which sailed the Mediterranean. He made 6 voyages with his father. In 1744, he was impressed, that means drafted, into service on a man-of-war, the HMS Harwich. Finding conditions intolerable, he deserted, which could have been, got him killed, but probably because of his Economic status, he was recaptured and publicly flogged and demoted to midshipman to common seaman. At his own request, he was exchanged into service on a slave ship, which took him to Sierra Leone. He eventually became captain of his own slave ship, and despite early religious training from his mother, who died when he was a child, he gave up active religious practice. On a voyage home, he was attempting to steer his ship through a horrendous storm when he experienced an epiphany, his great deliverance. When all seemed lost and the ship would surely sink, he cried, "Lord, have mercy upon us." Later, he believed God had spoken to him through the storm, and grace began to work on his behalf. For the rest of his life, he observed the anniversary of May 10th, 1748, as the day of his conversion, a day of humiliation in which he subjected his will to a higher power. Through many dangers, toils, and snares I have already come. 'Tis grace that brought me safe thus far, and grace will lead me home. Though some people have said he freed his slaves and sailed them back to Africa and left the slave trade, he actually continued in the slave trade for a time after his quote-unquote conversion, though it was said he saw to it that the slaves under his care were treated humanely, whatever that means. His example did inspire some others to become abolitionists, I'll give him that. So in terms of patriots or patriotism, somebody who proudly supports or defends his or her country and its way of life, slavery included, and pride and devotion to the country, or someone who's born or citizen of the country. So the Boston Massacre, which is basically depicting Crispus Attucks, I believe his mother was Natik, which is the East Coast tribe, and he was a maroon or a black Indian, if you will. So one of the first to die, or the first to die at the Boston Massacre. This is a picture of Crispus from Wikipedia. One of 5 people killed in the Boston Massacre, frequently named as the first martyr of the American Revolution, the only person killed whose name is commonly remembered. Though little is known for certain about him, including his ethnicity, this is according to Wikipedia, well, no, he's a black Indian. So I'm not sure why they are saying he's uncertain, but whatever. In the early 19th century, the abolitionist movement gained momentum in Boston. He was lauded as an example of a black American who played a heroic role in the United States, because he may also have been Wampanoag. His story has special significance for many Native Americans. So it's the Wampanoags, in case you didn't know, just like the Taino Nation made first contact at Guanahani Island. It's the Wampanoags that made first contact with the Pilgrims. So generally this phenomenon of black Indians. So black Indians are native African cultural hybrids who, for many reasons, do not necessarily establish maroon settlements, but instead live among white settlements or in native post-contact contexts with their native families until expelled for political and or economic reasons, as we've seen, particularly with the Cherokee, Choctaw, Creek, and others who've basically been expelling their black tribal members of African descent while retaining their blonde-haired, blue-eyed natives for economic gain. Okay, so black Indians blend within either context, native or majority white. In the era of exploration, many became trappers, scouts, led wagon trains, and were able to act as translators. So within the so-called 5 civilized tribes, you might want to pay attention in case this comes up on a final near you. Black slaves were used as translators for example, between the Cherokee and others. So post-contact African Americans intermarried with Indians as early as the mid-17th century, easily as early as soon as, for example, an outcome of the Pequot War. The Pequot War in 1636 and 1637 was between an alliance of Massachusetts Bay and Plymouth colonies with Native American allies, the Narragansetts and Mohegans, against the Pequot tribe. And this war saw the elimination of the Pequot as a viable political group and tribal group in what is now present-day southern New England. Now there's a book called Revenge of the Pequot, in which the Pequot are like one of the largest and most politically powerful black Indian tribes, who have one of the largest casinos on the planet in Mystic Woods. Foxwoods is the name of it, and it's in Connecticut. So many Pequots were killed by the colonists in that war. More were captured, sold into slavery in Bermuda, as well as within New England, and any escaped death, capture, or slavery scattered. So it took them more than 3.5 centuries to regain their former political and economic power in their traditional homeland along the Pequot, the Thames, and Mystic Rivers in what's now southeastern Connecticut, where they today have again, the largest casino complexes on the planet. Now, earlier when I said, early in the broadcast, that Native Americans were specifically targeted for destruction. In strictly Western terms, the Pequot were like the Federal Reserve Bank for Indian country. They created money. And the money was wampum. Okay? They were the keepers of wampum. Okay? They basically, so wampum, these wampum belts were basically made out of, and I can show you this because it's a particularly good example.
So wampum was in fact a form of currency?
Wampum was a form of currency. So for example, go back to slide here. All right, so wampum was a particular kind of clamshell, purple, or in this case it looks blue, all right? So it's a clamshell. And yeah, it's a seashell that you either find by fishing or it's on the, just like cowrie in Africa. Cowries are used in Africa, same idea. It's a medium of exchange. But in this case, wampum is not just clamshell money. The economy is a gift economy in which it's not simply we're exchanging surplus labor. I mean, essentially what a dollar is it represents surplus labor. And what surplus labor is let's say in an indigenous context, you are able to gather your own food, firewood, and cooking utensils. You can hunt or fish, or grow your own garden plot. So you have your basic necessities to feed and support your family. Suppose you acquire a specific skill like arrow making or basic plant gathering, whatever. Then you can trade that skill because that's surplus labor. And in an economy, you can trade that, and you can barter for that. So in this economy where wampum exists, it's not just the shell. The wampum belt is not just money, it's the story and the way by which we maintain peace and unity. That was valued in a gift economy. So it's a spiritual gift. Spiritual, cultural, and historical gift. That's the medium of exchange. And in a gift economy, you're supposed to exchange gifts of equal or superior value. The idea being that. And the Pequot were the makers of wampum. So if you were going to destroy native culture, you follow the money, right? And you follow the money makers. And so you get other tribes as, you know, notice the Pequot War, who you have two different native tribes who ally with the colonists to go after the Pequot. Now, whatever the Pequot did to the Mohegans and the Narragansetts, who knows? But they essentially wiped the Pequot, not exterminated them. Let's see, is this the one? A little further, right. Right. So the Pequots were essentially sold into slavery. And at that point, and so I visited their complex at Mystic River. And where they have, I mean, so if you were thinking of it, like, for example, if you think of every building on Lane Community College campus, so part of their mall, and they have 3 malls in this particular Foxwood complex, as well as 3 hotels. All right, so think of every building in LCC campus as a single building, basically united by corridors. Several music theater, movie theaters, boxing rings, convention centers, and a whole museum, essentially twice the size of the center building, which is basically telling their story, and they start their story with the glacier. And the glacier is like a mile of ice where, you know, oh, well, this is where we came from. And so what's very curious here at this museum is that not only the computer-generated storytelling special effects, but also kind of what's missing. So they talk about the Red Indians, and they talk about the time of destruction where they lost the war, but then the next thing you see is 20th century depictions of black Indians without telling where the black people came from. And where the black people came from was intermarriage, because they were all enslaved together. All right, so they were, you know, any who escaped death or weren't shipped to Bermuda basically stayed. So it took them about 350 years to regain certain, shall we say, political power. So Africans and natives intermarried when escaped African slaves, for example, conspired with native people in the Spanish colony of Mexico, as we've talked about. When the Mexican colonies were established in the mid-16th century, some Indians were even known to have slaves. Some tribes bought the slaves' freedom, and then the slaves resided with the Indians. So there are over 15 million, at least, descendants from the African Native American intermarriage. So intermarriage between Indians and Africans and Europeans were common enough in the eastern seaboard and southeastern states. So for example, Locklear is a common name of a tribe of mixed European, African, and Native roots. It means hold fast to our mixed culture, as in Heather Locklear, the actress. So many of those mixed race or mixed blood families were forced to choose one culture over another. Because of the U.S. contempt for both African and American Indians, many families chose to hide their African and/or Indian heritage. So throughout post-contact American history, the longest and most consistent contact between American Indians and people of African descent occurred among those tribes that the federal government designated as the 5 civilized tribes, that is, the Cherokees, Chickasaws, Choctaws, Creeks, and Seminoles. So while most family history is known only by oral histories, some information can be found, for example, in the freedmen rolls of the 5 civilized tribes. So that's how I knew my ancestry, because great-great-grandpa was on the freedmen rolls of the Choctaw. But the idea about their being civilized, so for example, little connection known about Oregon. So I think, and we'll get into that in a little bit. But when Samuel Thurston wrote his policy banning black people, what he was reacting to was the Red Stick War, in which, among other things, the Creeks killed an entire settlement of settlers but left the black slaves alive, who then joined the tribe. So he was afraid that that would happen in Oregon. And you'll see his treatise when we get to that piece of Oregon history. But the 5 civilized tribes, so-called because they adopted Christianity, they adopted a written syllabary if they hadn't had one before, so i.e. books. They adopted agriculture, they adopted Western dress, and they lived in square houses. And they did this in concessions for land, which all their land was traded away and given away by the government, and then they were forced marched to reservations in other states, hence their Trail of Tears. So when the Dawes, yeah, go ahead.
First of all, they collude with the governments, and then they're still sent away to a reservation.
Yes, right, right. And actually, you know, certainly it's part of my family history, but it's, you know, like warning, don't have any dealings with the government. They're going to double cross you. They do not see you as equal. Okay? Do not trade land for fire. I mean, this is one of the pieces with Handsome Lake. Okay? Where religious leaders who specifically forbade, 1, that the tribal members don't drink alcohol, and 2, we ain't going to trade land for fire water. We ain't going to do that. All right? Those people were specifically targeted by the government for incarceration or death. And then, you know, reservations were flooded with alcohol in clear contravention of alcohol law. We must also understand that where the Bureau of Indian Affairs came from was the War Department. And how do you treat people when you're at war with them? Right. Okay, you come up with these treaties. Well, yeah, they don't literally mean what they say here. You better check out what they mean when they say this. Because English can be tricky language, right? So black Indians, so the Dawes Roll. So essentially the Indian Wars was the loss of land, people, and culture in the Indian Wars because of the axiology that is the cultural values of European Americans who like to count and measure things. The idea of the Dawes Rolls, Dawes basically saying, okay, we have to count who's on the Indian tribes, who's part of the tribe. So we're going to put their names on a list. And so that's what the Dawes Roll is, and that's how you can say that you're an enrolled tribal member if you have an ancestor that was on the Dawes Rolls, which is the official U.S. government recognition of tribal sovereignty. You ain't on the roll, you ain't an Indian. And so with the Dawes Rolls, Native people who, in the estimate of the white people taking the census, now the white people are not, they do not have a vested interest in counting everybody that's there the same way. They do not. They want to eliminate them as much as possible without killing them. Okay? So, A census usually means that you are taking everybody else down, everybody. But that's not necessarily happening here, right? So in the census, if a person appeared more African than Indian, and whose call is that to make? Them or the white dude sitting behind the desk? Okay, they were put in what was called the darky tent. This literally happened. Okay, if you're too dark, oh, well, you're not Indian. Doesn't matter that both your parents could be native. Oh, if you're dark skinned, oh, you're in the darky tent. In that tent, their names were put down and all trace of their native heritage was bureaucratically erased. All of it. Oh, you're not black, you're not Indian, you're black. In the darky tent. So these people, so noted, were referred to then after that as freedmen. Okay, because we brought you here as slaves from Africa, and you may have escaped into Indian country and lived free among them, but now, no, they are domestic dependent nations now. And we're only going to deal with the red Indians. You black Indians, you a special breed. Doesn't matter that the Indians have accepted you, you fought alongside them, you're fully fledged tribal members, that doesn't matter. As far as we're concerned, you're dark, i.e. black. Okay, so in other words, even if you were half native, on paper you were Negro. You could even be full native. So remember last week when we talked about blood quantum, this was the system that was devised to basically say, okay, if you're half native and half black, well, you're a freedman. You're not native anymore. Now, we're coming up within the generation of crisis, we're talking about that many of these native tribes joined the Confederacy or fought on the side of the South. In part to preserve their slaves. That's one way of looking at it. But then they might have said, oh, well, we switched sides. Doesn't matter. You allied with the South or the North. You didn't ally with the North. So what happens when the South loses is that those freed men are now part of your tribe by treaty, which becomes problematic a little later. Okay, so black Indians were considered fully fledged members of their tribe, intermarrying, voting in elections, sitting on tribal councils, and receiving benefits. Lighter skinned members, particularly those who had intermarried with whites, began to assert that black Indians or freedmen were never actually citizens and that they don't have Native American blood, despite evidence to the contrary, including the historical evidence. Now, part of why they were doing that was economic. So if the black freedmen have been with your tribe longer than the blonde-haired, blue-eyed Indians, what basis are you kicking them out on? If they're, Taya Miles, who's an author who has done extensive research on kind of racial attitudes, especially with black Indians around looking at these particular questions, basically found that among the Cherokee there were certain attitudes in which you first want to marry, your preference is marrying a Cherokee. Then, if you can't marry a Cherokee, marry another Native American. Then, if you can't marry a Cherokee or a Native American, then the next preference is to marry a white person. Because marrying blacks or Mexicans pollutes the blood. Now, where did they get that idea? That marrying black or Mexicans pollutes blood. Not from the blacks or Mexicans, and not from traditional native values. So in '83, Cherokee tribe established a rule requiring citizens to carry a certificate of the degree of Indian blood. Federal document available to anyone whose ancestors are listed on the Dawes Rolls, 1906 Indian census that excludes freedmen. 2000, the Seminoles expelled all 2,000 black members and denied their families a cut of the reparations money from slavery, never mind that their ancestors joined the tribe in the 18th century, endured the march from Florida to Oklahoma, and have considered themselves Indians for generations. So ironically, some new hope is emerging from an unlikely place, the front lines of genetic science, in which, oh, are we Indians because our DNA 23andMe tells me I am? Or, yes, that will be interesting. So basically, start all this the generation of crisis. We're talking about slavery, racial identity. All this stuff has its roots in this time where people are basically trying to figure this complex question out. Not that, are we just simply human, or what does it mean to be my particular racial, genetic, whatever category, and where that history comes from. So we'll continue this more on Wednesday.
Couple of points.
Yes.
I mean, once the DNA stuff begins to really sort of identify who is and who isn't, it's going to be a lot of lawsuits popping up.
Oh, sure.
Millions.
Right.
Right. So.
Could be.
But with adults,